It is the winter of 1944, and somewhere along a frozen road in Belgium, a column of American soldiers watches the sky. They've learned to watch the sky now. They've learned it the hard way. From the screaming sound of engines dropping low out of nowhere, from the crack of cannon fire walking across the snow, from the burning trucks and the men you dragged into the ditch because there was nothing else you could do. The Luftwaffe's fighter bombers, the Jabos, had turned every open road in Europe into a hunting ground. And the weapon the army had given these men to fight back, a pair of .50 caliber machine guns bolted to a half-track, was barely enough to make the pilots flinch. Somewhere back in New York, a small engineering firm had already drawn the plans for something that would change all of that. The army wasn't sure it was worth building. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. To understand why the Quadmount was born, you have to understand what the war looked like from ground level in 1942 and 1943. The United States Army had entered the Second World War with almost no credible defense against low-flying enemy aircraft. The threat wasn't theoretical, it was intimate, and it was lethal. In North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, columns of men and machines moving through open terrain were exposed to the kind of attack that ground soldiers dreaded most, the strafing run. A German fighter bomber would drop to treetop level, line up on a road, and spend 4 or 5 seconds raking it with cannon fire and machine gun rounds. By the time the sound reached the men at the far end of the column, the damage was already done. Trucks on fire, ammunition cooking off, men in the dirt. The Army's answer at the time was the M13 multiple-gun motor carriage, an M3 half-track equipped with the Maxen M33 mount, which held exactly 2 Browning M2.50 caliber heavy machine guns on a rotating turret. Against aircraft, the M2 Browning was a genuinely excellent weapon. It fired heavy, fast rounds and had a reliable reputation stretching back to John Moses Browning's original 1921 design, but a single M2 had a rate of fire of roughly 450 to 550 rounds per minute. Against a fast-moving fighter diving at over 300 miles per hour, that wasn't concentrated enough. You needed to fill the sky with steel. 2 guns gave you a ceiling. The pilot knew where that ceiling was. He could work below it, dive through it fast enough that the burst missed, and be gone before the gunner could correct his aim. The anti-aircraft artillery units in North Africa filed their after-action reports. The report said the same thing in different words. 2 guns were not enough. The pilots weren't afraid. German Jabo pilots, the fighter bomber specialists flying the FW-190 and the Bf-109, had developed their low-level attack tactics to near perfection. They came in fast, they came in low, and they left before the defenses could respond. And the men on the ground, the men watching the sky, knew that every mile of road they traveled, every hour of daylight, meant exposure to something they could not stop. The question was not whether the army needed a better solution. The question was what that solution would look like, who would build it, and whether anyone in a position of authority would listen before it was too late. The WL Maxen Corporation of New York was not a famous name. It wasn't Boeing or Grumman or Lockheed, the kind of contractor that had cocktail parties thrown in its honor. It was a mid-sized engineering firm run by people who understood precision mechanics and knew how to build things that worked under punishment. They had already developed the M33 twin mount, the Army's existing 2-gun solution, and they understood its limitations better than anyone. The engineers at Maxen had watched the same reports come back from the field that everyone else had watched. They had seen the kill rates. They had done the math on what a single-gun firing window looked like against a fighter traveling at 300 miles per hour at low altitude. They had also done another kind of math, the kind that asks, what happens if you double the number of guns? The answer, on paper, was seductive. 4 guns instead of 2 meant a combined rate of fire that would theoretically reach 1,600 rounds per minute, nearly tripling the density of fire a single M2 could produce. But doubling the guns wasn't just bolting on 2 extra barrels. The mount had to handle the recoil of 4 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously. It had to traverse and elevate fast enough to track an aircraft moving in 3 dimensions, because a slow turret against a fast plane was just an expensive way to miss. It had to be powered, because no human gunner could manually swing that much weight quickly enough across a 360-degree field. And it had to be built on a platform mobile enough to move with an advancing army. The engineers at Maxen drew the plans. They reworked the M33 frame to accept 2 additional guns, mounting them in pairs, 2 on the left side of the turret, 2 on the right. The turret was driven by an electrically powered traverse system, fed by a pair of rechargeable 6-volt batteries. It could rotate a full 360 degrees. It could elevate from 10 degrees below horizontal all the way to 90 degrees straight up. One gunner sat inside the mount on a canvas seat, framed by 4 barrels, controlling the whole assembly with 2 handles and a reflex sight. 2 loaders flanked the mount, feeding 200 round belt drums into each weapon. When Maxen brought this proposal forward, there were skeptics. There were people in procurement who looked at the complexity and saw liability. What happened when one gun jammed? What happened when the electrical system failed? What happened when 4 guns overheated in sequence? There were people who thought the army already had enough anti-aircraft capability, that the existing twin-gun half-tracks were doing an acceptable job, and that the resources required to develop and manufacture a new mount were better spent elsewhere. Acceptable, they said. Acceptable? As if the men dying on those roads would have chosen that word. But something was about to happen that would make the argument academic. Something was coming that would prove, with a brutality that no procurement officer could ignore, exactly why 2 guns were not enough. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. In the pre-dawn darkness, more than 200,000 German soldiers pushed through the frozen tree line in the largest German offensive action on the Western Front since the fall of France. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and it hit the Allied lines with a violence that shattered units, created gaps 80 miles wide, and threatened to drive all the way to the port of Antwerp. In the first 72 hours, fog and overcast skies grounded Allied air support almost entirely. The men on the ground were on their own, fighting armor, fighting artillery, fighting infantry through snow and ice and the kind of cold that jams rifle bolts and freezes the grease in machine gun mechanisms. And through that cold, through that chaos, the Luftwaffe arrived. German fighter bombers exploited the low cloud ceiling, flying beneath the overcast to attack Allied supply lines, troop columns, and artillery positions. The M13 half-tracks with their M33 twin mounts were deployed, and they fought hard. But the reports from unit after unit said the same thing they'd been saying since North Africa. 2 guns. Not enough. The pilots came in fast, took their runs, and the twin mounts simply couldn't saturate the airspace quickly enough to reliably hit them. Meanwhile, across the front, the M45 Quadmount had begun reaching units. Not in the numbers that would eventually be produced. Roughly 4,800 units would be completed before the war ended, but enough that some anti-aircraft artillery battalions had them, and the men who had them noticed something immediately. When you pointed 4 Browning M2s at a plane and pressed the trigger, the sky in front of that plane ceased to be a place where survival was likely. Pilots who had learned exactly how to thread through the fire of a twin mount found themselves flying into something different. Something that didn't have the same gaps, something that filled the corridor with lead from edge to edge. The Battle of the Bulge was catastrophic for the Allies in its early days. But among the chaos, among the retreating units and the surrounded battalions and the frozen roads choked with refugees, something was also being learned. And by the time the skies cleared and Allied fighters could fly again, by the time the American lines had held and the German offensive had stalled and the push back toward Germany began, the army had a very clear picture of what the Quadmount could do. The question now was what happened when they used it in a place where everything, absolutely everything, depended on the answer. On the morning of March the 7th, 1945, a 26-year-old lieutenant named Karl Timmermann and a small group of men from the 9th Armored Division came over a ridge above the Rhine River and saw something that stopped them in their tracks. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Intact. Bridges across the Rhine had been the obsession of every Allied commander for months. Germany had destroyed them all, one by one, as the Wehrmacht fell back, because a bridge across the Rhine was a road into Germany's heartland, and Germany could not afford to let that road exist. The Ludendorff Bridge was supposed to be demolished. It wasn't. Timmermann's men crossed it under fire, and within hours the 9th Armored Division had a bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine. The Germans understood immediately what they had lost. The bridge at Remagen was not just a tactical asset. It was a door, and it was open. Hitler ordered it destroyed. The Luftwaffe was given the mission. Over the next 10 days, the Germans sent everything they had at that bridge: conventional fighter bombers, artillery fire, V-2 rockets, and in one of the first ever operational uses of jet aircraft in a ground attack role, Arado R-234 jet bombers. The geography of the Rhine Valley worked against the attackers. The river runs between steep, cliff-like banks at Remagen, and any aircraft approaching the bridge had to climb over the ridgelines and then drop steeply into the valley, flying directly into the face of whatever anti-aircraft weapons were waiting there. The Americans had positioned their anti-aircraft defenses with everything available. Among those defenses were the M15 and M16 multiple-gun motor carriages, the half-tracks equipped with the M45 Quadmount, the weapon that Maxsen had built, and the army had almost not ordered. The gunners of the 482nd AAA Battalion took their positions, and then the Luftwaffe came. What happened at Remagen over the next 3 weeks is documented in U.S. Army records that are as close to stunning as military bureaucracy gets. The German pilots were not amateurs. They were flying the best aircraft the Luftwaffe could put in the air, including jets, aircraft so fast they could outrun any conventional Allied fighter in a straight line. They pressed their attacks with genuine courage, because their leadership demanded it and because Germany needed that bridge destroyed. They flew sortie after sortie into the Remagen Valley. The M45 gunners developed what they called barrage fire. Because the valley walls funneled every attacking aircraft through a predictable corridor, the gunners learned to fill that corridor with continuous fire rather than tracking individual planes. The combined rate of fire of the Quadmounts, 1,600 rounds per minute per mount, multiplied across batteries of them, created curtains of half-inch steel through which no aircraft could fly without being hit. The normal procedure was to alternate fire between the upper and lower pairs of guns to manage heat and ammunition flow. But in the concentrated bursts that stopped a dive, there was no room to miss. By the time the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17, 1945, not from German bombs, but from the structural damage of the earlier failed demolition attempts and the weight of traffic it had carried, the 482nd AAA Battalion and the other anti-aircraft units defending Remagen had shot down 21 enemy aircraft. Across the entire defense, the M45 Quadmounts were credited with roughly 30% of all German aircraft casualties in the battle for the bridge. They had stopped jets. They had stopped dive bombers. They had stopped everything the Luftwaffe sent at them. The bridge had stood long enough. Patton's Third Army had crossed. The door into Germany was open, and it was not going to close again. The men who operated the M45 Quadmount in the field gave it names that tell you everything you need to know about what it felt like to be on the receiving end. They called it the meat chopper. They called it the kraut mower. These were not nicknames given by engineers in New York. These were the names given by German soldiers and by Allied gunners who had watched what happened when 4.50 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously into a column of men or a line of low-flying aircraft. The rounds fired by a single M2 Browning could penetrate light vehicle armor, shred aircraft control surfaces, and kill at ranges exceeding a mile. 4 of them, firing in concert, did not simply increase the lethality. They created a qualitatively different weapon. One that altered the calculations of every Luftwaffe pilot who flew against a position defended by it. The reach of the Quadmount extended far beyond Europe. The US Navy tested it aboard Essex-class aircraft carriers, mounting 6 units on the USS Lexington in May 1945 as a potential answer to the kamikaze threat that was killing American sailors at a horrifying rate. The fast, steep-diving angle of kamikaze attacks ultimately proved too demanding for the M45's tracking capability against jet-speed targets, but the experiment itself speaks to how thoroughly the weapon had earned its reputation. Approximately 10,000 units were eventually produced. The M45 did not disappear when the war ended. It served through Korea, where it was again used against ground targets as much as aircraft. It served into Vietnam, mounted on trucks and armored vehicles, performing the same role it had been born to perform, protecting advancing columns from attack. The W.L. Maxson Corporation, the small New York engineering firm that had proposed quadrupling the guns when the army was uncertain whether doubling them was worth the trouble, had built something that outlasted the war by 3 decades. There is a particular kind of courage that gets less attention than it deserves. Not the courage of the man in the foxhole, though that courage is real and enormous, but the courage of the person who looks at a problem everyone else has decided is manageable and refuses to accept that answer. The engineers at Maxson looked at a twin-gun mount and saw a weapon that was leaving men exposed. They looked at the reports from North Africa and didn't conclude that the reports were wrong. They concluded that the weapon was wrong. They built something that the Army's procurement system wasn't sure it needed, and they built it well enough that it served for 30 years and killed German jets with half-inch machine gun rounds over a river in Germany. The M45 Quadmount is not the most famous weapon of the Second World War. It doesn't have the mythology of the Sherman tank or the B-17, but on a bridge in Remagen in March 1945, while the Luftwaffe threw jets and dive bombers and every desperate weapon it had left at a single crossing point, 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns on an electrically powered turret held the sky. They held it long enough. And sometimes in war, long enough is everything. If this story belongs in your collection, if this is the kind of history you want to see more of, subscribe, and we'll keep bringing it to you. There are 1,000 stories like this one buried in the records of the Second World War, and we're not done yet.